Okay, welcome to another episode of New England Horror Files podcast. Tonight we are joined by Leslie Landrigan of New England Historical Society. Leslie is a former journalist and publisher of the New England Historical Society website. She's a co-author of a dozen books on New England history, and her latest book explores French immigration to the region and also connects the impact of the French and Indian War to the Salem Witch Trials. I find this really interesting. So, Leslie, obviously the Salem Witch Trials are a very dark part of New England history, but it seems like a lot of the actual causes and events leading up to that don't really seem to be quite as evident or well known or talked about. So I'm really excited to jump into this topic about a bit with you. Where would you start? Where would the what do you think was the most important thing to touch on and kind of go from there?
Well, I think one thing that's important to understand is exactly where Salem and the other communities that were involved in the witch trials, and there were a lot. They were generally in Essex County, which is in northern Massachusetts. And that geography is really important because northern Massachusetts is near Maine. Um, Back then, at the time of the Salem witch trials, Maine wasn't, you wouldn't view Maine as vacation land. It wasn't even Maine. It was Acadia. It was part of it was part of New France, which the French had colonized, and it was a battleground. The French had settled. The French had settled Quebec shortly after the English had settled Plymouth and Jamestown. And the French colonies were growing, but more slowly than the English colonies. So, as these two nations were vying for control of North America, Maine was kind of, or Acadia then was the flashpoint. And during most people probably know the story about Betty Paris and Abigail Williams in January of 1692. They started to have fits. And 4 days after that was a horrible, horrible massacre in York, Maine, which is a little bit over the New Hampshire border. And it was a war party of 300 French and native warriors who massacred a village. And many of the people in Essex County knew the victims or were related to them or had been there. There were a lot of ties between Acadia and Essex County in Massachusetts. And so this was called the Candlemas Massacre because it happened on Groundhog Day, which used to be Candlemas. And that really fueled the sense of war panic that had already permeated Salem. There were a lot of war refugees in Salem. There were a lot of people from Salem and the surrounding areas who were killed in brutal and horrible ways in these wars. And people were very afraid. And that sense of fear was really magnified because if the French and Indians could take out York, Maine, then Salem and Essex County were vulnerable.
That makes a lot of sense when you think about it in that context, especially when you think about like the surrounding frontier, if you will, and the
Mm-hmm.
wars. Let's can we touch a little bit on the wars preceding this, because a good amount of people know about King Philip's War, maybe if we're
Yes.
lucky. But I think that's probably the most famous, that's just generally talked about. But in reality, these wars were much greater than that, and they spanned a much bigger area than King Philip's War was, I don't want to say a small area, but not, you don't think of it in the entirety of New England, which when you go back to the wars in general, that's where it was the entire, because there was a lot of fighting going on in Maine and moving into, Western Maine and whatnot. So, um, What can you tell us about that? Like in the beginning of like that moving into the York, Maine massacre.
Well, King Philip's War absolutely devastated New England. I
Mm,
think 8% of the adult male population was killed. And I think the number was nine towns were completely wiped out. But many of the natives who fled, or who, I mean, the natives lost the war.
right,
They, rather than being sold into slavery or killed, they fled to Maine.
right.
and they joined forces. They went to There was a confederation of natives called the Wabanaki Confederacy, and the refugees from King Philip's War went to Maine and said, "Hey, come join us," and they did, because the English were encroaching. And one of the things that I've learned only, I guess, from living in Maine, is that the French had a very different attitude toward the natives than the English did. They viewed the Indian nations as sovereign, and the English did not. And the French treated the Indians way better than the English did.
Mm,
So, of course, they're going to side with the French. Part of the problem that the French and the Indians faced, the natives, of course, had been decimated by European diseases
mm,
and battles with the Iroquois. That's a whole nother thing. But the French were not proliferating as fast as the English. And in order to hang on to Maine, they used some very brutal tactics. It was a
mm,
terror campaign, really, and it worked. And one of the more interesting, there's some very interesting characters who were kind of around the Salem Witch Trials. One was Baron Saint Castin, who Castine, Maine was named after him. He was a French baron, the younger son of a baron whose older brother died. But he came to Canada when he was 13 years old as part of a French regiment. They were siding with one group of natives against another group to protect their fur trade, because beaver hats were so popular in Paris. And St. Castin settled in what is now Castine, Maine, and he married the daughter of a great Penobscot sachem, Mataquando. And in order to encourage the French to populate Maine, King Louis XIV said, "Okay, this regiment who were sent there, were sent to Maine." King Louis said, "Hey, we'll give you money and you can marry Indians if you stay." And St. Castin really liked it there. He made a
mm.
lot of money trading fur, and he really liked the native ways. He really liked living with the Penobscots. And when the English started encroaching on, west of the Kennebec River, really, St. Castin and Mataquando led a series of terrifying raids against the English settlements and pretty much wiped Maine clear of English settlements. And that whole series of raids and murders and torture and awful things happening was known as King William's War. St. Castin's descendants are still around. And one thing that you'll notice about Maine is that there are not a lot of houses that were built before, say, 1750.
What's the time period we're talking about here when we're talking about um the beginning of the French and Indian Wars till the end, I guess.
Well,
I know.
yeah, King Philip's was 1675 to 1676. And then I actually wrote this down. King William's was 1688 to 1697, and they all had about 8 names. King William's War was also known as St. Castin's War. But there was Queen Anne's War from 1702 to 1713, Father Rail's War. The Jesuits were very involved in the war making, which, didn't exactly endear the Protestant Puritans to the Catholics. They already hated them. But
Right.
Father Rail's War was the third one, or fourth if you count King Philip's War, and that was 1722 to 1725. King George's War from 1744 to 1748, Father Le Loutre's War from 1749 to 1755. I mean, Maine was not a
There's
fun place.
no.
And then the big one, the big French and Indian War, was 1754 to 1763. And that was really the only one that was like a European war, where you had soldiers in uniform and regiments and battlefields. Both the French and the English decided, all right, let's double down and get this thing over. So that was the end of it. But that was really the only real war.
It's crazy if you think about it too, because at the time, from the time they started coming over here, we'll use Plymouth as just kind of a point of reference, but after that, the English were just coming over in droves. I mean, it was insane. And if you think about the English mindset, I guess, like you said, the French treated the native population very differently versus the English. I've heard lectures about King Philip's War and how it was very clear why they went against the English because of the, what's the word, conversion. They were diehard to get them to become, I don't
Yes,
know,
Christians.
Christians, right, yeah, well, yeah, Christians. But if you look at the French mentality is very different. Now I don't know, are they marrying in just to take control of the land, or because what are their intentions there? However, you can definitely see that the mindset is very different. It's much more of like a kind of like a mutual respect, as opposed to you must be a Christian or you're not, like. And
Yeah.
so, and what's also the fact that early America, as we know it, English America, or European America, was beset by all of this war. I mean, that's 100 years of war.
Oh, yeah.
Warfare, and then there's the Revolutionary War, and so it's like it's all war. This is how it starts. This is the mindset. I mean, we live in a very different time now, but I'm sure you can imagine, it's, being in that time, and that, if worrying that that's a threat, or like a possibility that there could be a massacre where you live, like that's. So leading into Salem, if this is the mindset of just war and, in this new land and whatever, it's, I'm not sure the word, but geez,
It was a very frightening, unsettling place. The couple things happened too in the run up to the Salem Witch Trials. One had to do with William Phipps, who I don't think you'd have the witch trials without William Phipps. He was an uneducated adventurer he was a treasure hunter who actually found treasure. He went down to the Caribbean and raised Spanish treasure worth $20 million. And for that, he got a knighthood and married into a shipbuilding family. So here's this guy who really has no education. He supposedly had 24 brothers and sisters. And he was from Maine, which is also important. He led in 2 years before the witch trials, he led an expedition to Quebec to, well, basically capture the city. And it was a horrible failure. He brought 2,300 men, many from Essex County, many who, had were involved in some way in the Salem witch trials. And out of 2,300 men, 1,000 died. So
Wow.
yeah. So that was kind of a problem for him, even though he and it's funny, you see things happening then that are still happening today. Came back and wrote, a letter, which would now be viewed as a press release, about how successful his Quebec expedition would be. But anyway, New England was going through changing government at the time. He went to England. He was supported by the Mathers, Increase and Cotton Mather. And he went to England with Increase, and he got a new charter, and he came back as governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I think he came back in May of 1692, which was about 4 or 5 months after the Salem witch hysteria had started. And he had a fragile new government. He messed up the Quebec expedition. So what do? You go and attack someone as a terrorist or a communist or a witch,
Diversion.
Yeah,
Create a
exactly.
problem and solve it. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Something else that had happened 2 years before the Salem witch trials was a slave, an enslaved Black man named John ran away and was captured. And he said that he was planning on joining a slave insurrection that was going to be led by a guy named Isaac Moulton. And Isaac Moulton was from the Isle of Jersey. He was probably a Huguenot, a French Protestant who fled France, and he spoke French. And this guy, Isaac Moulton, was going to lead 300 freed Indian and Black slaves in a revolt against Essex County. Another slave was captured, and he said, yeah, it's true. So that really helped to spread fear and loathing, against Catholics, against French, against Black people, against Indians.
Huh. That's interesting. That's a story you never hear.
No, I can't remember where I dug it up. But anyway, so Phipps comes back, and everybody in Salem is in hysterics. Well, some people in Salem are in hysterics. And he calls for a court of oyer and terminer, which is a special court that is held to investigate serious crimes. And then he takes off to fight the war in Maine. And he puts his lieutenant governor in charge, William Stoughton, who I am convinced was a sociopath. The guy was just, he put that killing machine into action so fast. It was, you really think there was something wrong with the guy.
Yeah, I think,
Well,
I don't want to generalize, but I think, I honestly do think there's a lot of people and even today, that want to be in power because they want to control and abuse other people. I really do think, and that's probably been going on since the beginning of time,
Mm-hmm.
Can't disagree.
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard to. I mean, I'm being very general, obviously, but yeah, this sort of stuff doesn't surprise me. We have like corrupt politicians and corrupt law enforcement today. We have virtually the same thing several hundred years ago. So
it doesn't change. So many.
God.
No, what I was going to say was that some of the accusers were refugees from the war in Maine. There were one of the witches, George Burroughs, had been a minister in Falmouth, which is now Portland. And some of the accusers, Mercy Lewis, was it Mercy Lewis or Mercy Short? They all had the same names, all these Abigails and Betty.
Yeah, they did.
And so forth. Yeah, it's kind of confusing. But and some of the imagery in the accusations was, you could tell it came from came from, oh, I forgot something. There was something else that happened. And it kind of shows the link between the war panic and the witch hysteria, which is after they found out about this guy who was going to lead a slave rebellion, they heard that there was a spectral army in Gloucester. And yeah, Gloucester is one peninsula north of Salem. So they heard that this army was lurking around Gloucester and that it was firing bullets at people, and they didn't do any damage, and that they were tramping around the swamps and they didn't leave any footprints. And so for 10 days, the people of Gloucester gathered in their garrison, and the militia went out trying to find the spectral army. And supposedly someone fired, I don't know where this comes from, someone fired a silver button at the spectral army and it disappeared. But then there was another version that they invoked the name of God and the spectral army disappeared. But it kind of goes to the sense of fear and why you would start accusing people of witchcraft.
So let me recover from hearing that. No, this is so fascinating because it really gives you such a glimpse into the mindset of the time. And we've talked about spectral evidence before, and we're always looking for example because it's actually back in the day was fairly common to use it.
Oh yeah.
Which blows my mind, but fine. Um, this is a different time, sure, okay. But it's just fascinating to see such another, and that's a very different, that's a whole army, or
Yeah.
whatever, marching
Yeah.
through, like that's just so many thoughts are going through my head right now about that, and that's just another story that you never hear. But it really does speak to where they were at mentally.
And these were tough times, as you said, Mary, the Puritans were really successful. The English,
Mm.
especially the Puritans, they, they were very disciplined and hardworking, and had a ton of children. And John Winthrop talked about his city on the hill, and we're going to be a shining example for the world. And for 50 years it looked like it was working. They had a very high standard of living, and in fact they may have had the highest standard of living in the world at the time, just in general. They were really doing well. Of course, when you go and just grab a bunch of land, things can work out.
Right.
But yeah, but King Philip's War and the war in the French and Indian Wars, it looked like, to the Puritan mind, it looked like the French, the papists, the French papists, with all their weird and frightening rituals, the heathen Indians, and you can throw in the godless fishermen too, because there are a lot of fishermen up there. They had formed an alliance with Satan, and Satan was winning, and they needed to fight back somehow. In fact, Betty Paris's father, Betty Paris was one of the first accusers. Her father was a preacher, a minister, who was engaged in a lot of controversy, and he was preaching against, Satan's army coming to get us. You better be ready for Satan's army. And again, he was doing what Phipps did, find a scapegoat.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I'm totally enthralled with this. So, and it's interesting you said about George Burroughs. He was one of the accused, and
Yes.
he was a minister in.
Yes, and I think, in fact, some of the accused were from Maine. As someone said, if you were from Maine, you had the whiff of the devil about you. And Burroughs was very strong he was like weirdly strong. He was a short guy and he was very, very strong. And he'd had two wives. And some of the accusations were one of the accusers had worked as a servant. And you read about the Salem Witch Trials and you get the feeling that it was a bad idea to be an abusive boss because there was a way to get back to you. And I just have this sense that Burroughs was not a nice guy and he got accused. And of course he was from Maine, and even though he was a Puritan minister, I think there were some things that people didn't like about him, and so
Right.
he got hanged. He died on the gallows.
So I didn't know that about him. Now, granted, I haven't done a ton of research specifically about Salem. I mean, I've done a lot of like New England research, but like not cursory, but general. Um, but that's just so interesting with the Maine angle, Maine the state, I mean.
Yeah, which would
Or
have been Acadia at the time.
right,
And
yeah,
and
not a
the other
state yet.
yeah, and the other thing to understand about Maine at the time, um, I think I may have said this, but it was not vacation land. There were a
Right,
lot of a lot of commercial ties. The fur trade was huge. The fishing off of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, fortunes were made with the cod fishing and timber.
right,
So it was a very and it was really kind of an economic satellite of Massachusetts. And it wasn't just a place where poor farmers went to get some land. It was a gold mine for some people. And so there was a pretty intense interest in expanding into Maine. One of one of the most interesting people, and I did not know this until I got into the Huguenots, but um, one of the more interesting um, victims, although he didn't hang, was a guy named Philip English, who was not English but French. And he came from the Isle of Jersey, just like that guy, Isaac Moulton, who was going to lead the slave revolution. And the Huguenots were Protestants from France who had it was sort of like the English Civil War all over again. The Huguenots, there were a lot of nobles who were Huguenots, and a lot of artisans, talented artisans who were Huguenots. And at the time that Samuel Champlain was founding Quebec around 1626 or whatever, um, King Henry the Fourth issued the Edict of Nantes, which said, Huguenots are allowed to live in France. We're not going to persecute them. You can have certain trades. You can do, it was a structured, tolerant regime. And then Louis the 14th came along and he wanted a Catholic empire. So what he did was, well, kicked out all the Huguenots. So the Huguenots went, and many of them were wealthy. They went to South America. They went to Ireland. They went to Jersey. They went to North America. They went all over the world, which meant that they had a lot of commercial ties, international commercial ties. And this guy, Philip English, was a Huguenot who escaped France, went to the Isle of Jersey, came to Salem just at the time when Salem was starting to emerge as a merchant shipping center, a very prosperous port. It was evolving from, little farms to, it was a behemoth, an economic behemoth in the China trade. Philip English was the richest man in Salem. He used his ties with other Huguenots to make a fortune. He had like 14 buildings and all these ships, and he brought a lot of people, well, at least 24, from Jersey. as indentured servants. The women were domestic servants, and the men worked his fishing boats in Nova Scotia. And so he was definitely suspect. His wife, but the way the witch trials kind of worked, they started out with the low hanging fruit, people who were vulnerable, single women and poor people. God, in the early days, they even accused a 4-year-old child of being a witch, and the child went mad in prison. It was really sad. But they started with poor, vulnerable people, and then they kind of climbed the ladder. So they often started with the wives of people, and then went after the guy. In fact, when it really reached a crescendo, when the hysteria reached a crescendo, they went after William Phipps's wife, the governor.
Right.
He was suspicious. He had no children, witches were supposed to be barren. He had a black slave, he had an Indian slave or a French slave, whatever. He was from Maine. That was bad. So Philip English's wife was arrested. She was kind of an arrogant woman, which didn't help. And she was taken they tried to grab her out of bed in the middle of the night, but she said, no, I'm not getting out of bed. Come tomorrow morning. And they did. And she said, no, I'm having my breakfast. You have to wait until I instruct my servants and get my children off to school or whatever. And they did. And then they put her, they incarcerated her. I think it was in a tavern, and they accused her of witchcraft. And Philip went to visit her every day, and she said, you gotta hide, you gotta hide. And he said, no. She said, they're going to come after you. And they did. He hid. He had a secret compartment in his house. The house is no longer there in Salem, but the street is English Street, and that's still there. But he hid, and then he escaped to Boston. And the jails were overflowing at this point. There were so many people, they had to send the prisoners to Boston. And Philip finally decided, all right, fine, I'll give myself up. And so he did. And a number of French people from Jersey, from the Isle of Jersey, were also accused in the witchcraft trials, or, not in the whole mess. So if you were French, you were definitely vulnerable. And of course, that goes back to the wars. But in the end, Philip English and his wife, Mary, escaped to New York, and all of their property was taken, or most of their property was taken. And they eventually got some of it back. But, a lot has been said and written about the envy that people had, and that was a motivator. And I think in the case of Philip English, yeah, I mean, he was a scary guy. He was doing stuff that nobody was doing before. Nobody was making fortunes on shipping. And
yeah. So you said the Huguenots, they had a substantial presence in the area.
No, not huge. But there were some. I believe a bunch of them sent a letter to the governor before the witch trial and said, can we come to Massachusetts? And he said, yeah, sure. They liked the Huguenots because they were, the Puritans liked the Huguenots because they were Protestant, and they were rich, and they were skilled. As a matter of fact, there were 3 places where the Huguenots concentrated. One was Boston, one was Narragansett, Rhode Island, and one, I believe, was near Worcester. And the Narragansett and the Worcester communities didn't survive. In Salem, it was pretty much the Philip English circle. Paul Revere was a Huguenot. In Boston, they tended to assimilate pretty quickly. In Salem, they didn't. In Salem, there were, a couple dozen Huguenot families, and they were clannish. They spoke French to each other. They were different. So hence, you're going to get accused of being a witch.
There is a story that I've heard from East Greenwich, Rhode Island, I think. This might be the same one you're talking about. And I don't remember all the details, but there was a Huguenot group, and they went
Yeah.
there, they acquired property somehow. Again, I don't remember all the details, but I know that part of this story is that they were doing their thing, and then they got kicked out or they got pushed out or something. I don't remember. Again, I this is
Yeah,
like
that may be the
it's there.
same. Yeah, maybe the same group. I that was a that was a rabbit hole I didn't go down.
Right, yeah. I just happen to have that little bit floating around right now that you mention it.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's one in Worcester too, but I guess it kind of failed.
Yeah.
But but yeah, talk about rabbit holes. You could spend your life studying the Salem Witch Trial. In fact, if you look at the last time I looked at the top 10 books about New England history, 7 of them were the Salem Witch Trial.
Well, I mean, it's so crazy to think you said a 4-year-old child went mad in the dungeon or the
Yeah.
jails.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
insanity. Like
Yeah.
it's funny. I talk all about, I often talk about human nature and how, like, we talked about earlier that there are some people in power who, abuse the power, and it's always been that way. That's a part
Yep.
of certain part of some people's human nature. So there's human nature that's always happening. But when you look at the Salem witch trials, it seems just so insane. It's just one of those things. Like, I always look back on, any rendition I've ever seen in, like, The Crucible, or, when you read what they were saying and the girls pointing, it sounds so dramatic to me. And I
Yeah.
get so mad because I'm just like, th- it's drama. It's not, it's like, to me, I just work myself up. I see, look at me, I'm already upset. I'm just like, this is just so ridiculous. But like, this really happened. It's not like, well, we threw some people in jail, and but there were hundreds of people accused, and
Yes.
and to say a 4-year-old child, like, and obviously that wasn't the norm, but are you kidding me? Like,
Oh,
what does that do to it's a baby? Like, so to look back on that, it's
Aside from that,
absolutely it. What's that?
was that due to the family? Aside from just the kid,
Hmm.
you know? God.
I think the mother went with the daughter to prison and the mother died and the child went mad. But yeah, it was completely crazy. And it did it didn't go, that was not something they could cover up. There, as I'm sure you know, there were witch trials in Connecticut as well. And
Hmm.
there was a kind of a mini witch hysteria before the Salem witch trials, and they covered that up. The it was
Let's
a
talk
long time before. Pardon me?
talk about that a little bit, because I want to see how far this reaches, because I've heard of it, back in England and Europe, well before colonized and
Oh yeah,
I've heard of a little bit like cursory about the Connecticut witch trials, but I don't know too much. And yeah, like what else was happening? Like, where was this going? It sounds like there were some, like, we've talked about some possible motives for what happened in Salem. It sounds like the Huguenots were maybe like an outcasted community for some reason, whatever, and
yeah,
many
oh
other
yeah,
reasons, just lots of hysteria over different things, and just being the wild frontier at the time that it was. But yeah, like, I wonder where was this, how else was this, and where else was this impacting people?
this was a Puritan thing. It was definitely a Puritan thing. And as a matter of fact, there were at least one, possibly two people accused of witchcraft in Connecticut during the Salem witch trials. And that didn't end up in people dying. I'm trying to remember when, I believe John Winthrop was governor of Connecticut when there were about, I believe, 8 people accused of witchcraft in Connecticut around Hartford. And I could probably find the dates pretty quickly. But some were hanged, And I believe Connecticut only recently pardoned. Some of the descendants are have been asking for pardons of the witches. I think Massachusetts already did, but it was only recently that Connecticut pardoned the witches who were hanged. There weren't any in Rhode Island. There were some in New Hampshire. Typically, what happened, with the exception of the Connecticut witchcraft hysteria, which was kind of a mini version of Salem, typically what would happen would be someone would be accused of witchcraft, and he or she would go to Boston, and the courts would look at the evidence, and in most cases they found the accused person innocent. There was one in Hampton, New Hampshire. There were some out in Western Massachusetts. I don't think there were any in Maine, but it was pretty much a Puritan thing. And of course, Connecticut and Massachusetts and parts of New Hampshire were pretty Puritan.
Yeah. Now, was this all happening roughly the same time?
No, I think the Connecticut witchcraft trials happened earlier.
Okay.
And I can look up the date. But no one was hanged as a witch after 1692, or 1693, after the Salem witchcraft trials. It was kind of the end of the Puritan theocracy. Increase Mather, for example, was, a very powerful minister. And his son Cotton never achieved the stature of his father, in part because of his participation in the trial. He kind of egged it on. One of the differences in the Salem witchcraft trial was spectral evidence. I can't remember if it was William Stoughton or William Phipps said, yeah, you can use spectral evidence, but it was the use of spectral evidence that allowed it to get completely out of hand.
So crazy. So crazy.
Yeah.
It's nuts. So when the one guy, I think, was it Phipps, when his wife was accused, he was like, wait, no more spectral evidence.
Yeah, well,
something like that.
Yes, that's pretty much exactly what happened. He was off fighting the war in Maine when Stoughton went crazy, and he came back, and obviously they didn't have the internet, they didn't have news. He came back and found out that this massacre was going on, and he said, stop. So it was after, when did he stop it? He'd been gone. He ended it, let's see, May. Well, he started the Court of Oyer and Terminer on May 27th, and it ended on October 29th. That's not a lot of time to kill 20 people.
It's really not. So
no.
And
then so then that was the end of the spectral evidence, and he formed a Supreme Court of Judicature, and that went on into early 1693. But they quit hanging people, and he pardoned everybody, including his wife.
He was the governor, right? Phipps was the governor.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was a brand new governor.
So the structure of government obviously was different than it is now. But yes. So who is the governing body that, what's the question I'm trying to ask? Who oversaw the trials, or like allowed this to happen?
Who made the decision?
It was
pulled the trigger.
Well, yeah.
Not pulled the trigger, but like who signed the name,
It was Phipps. Well, Phipps was the guy he was a royal governor. This was brand new. They dissolved the Dominion of New England, which had been a combination of 4 states or 4 colonies. And they up until then, Massachusetts had elected its governor, and then Edmund Andros came and he was appointed by the king. So the government that came back was an elected General Assembly or General Court, and Phips was appointed by the king. So he was, a royal, he had the royal authority. He appointed the Court of Oyer and Terminer, and that court, it was 8 judges, and it was like a special prosecutor, like Ken Starr,
Yeah.
who, they had the authority to, and it came from Phips, but Phips was gone, and his psychopath lieutenant governor was in charge. So, and he would
Oh,
have also
I
been.
see.
And guess what? I got a date on the Connecticut witch trials. It was 45 years before Salem. And Connecticut tried 43 people for witchcraft, and most were acquitted or escaped, but 9 men and 2 women were executed as witches between 1647 and 1663.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That is interesting. So more men
Yeah.
than women, which is
Mm-hmm.
which is
Yes.
you don't often think about it you don't often think about it like so, but it's interesting to see that Connecticut more men.
Yeah.
No,
And
it's not like gender specific, I know, but it's just interesting to learn that.
I think it's the association because of the Salem witch trials, if anything, I,
yeah.
I only recently heard about the Connecticut witch trials, and just kind of I think mostly talking to you, the both of you about these things. So it's not something you really hear about.
And no, it's not. And as you're talking and putting out all these, facts about different states, I wonder how much the conflict in each state because I know that Connecticut had a series of I don't know if they were French and Indian per se, but I do know like the Pequot Wars, for example, and
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of warfare going on in Connecticut too.
Mm-hmm.
And we say that there were no witch trial sort of things happening in Rhode Island, where Rhode Island was built on a different notion of tolerance versus Massachusetts. And I know
Right.
there's more going on under the surface. However, Massachusetts was not that. But if you look at, what is now Maine was much more, like we've discussed with the relationship between the French and the native people there. So I wonder how much that really does play into because you look at Connecticut, there's warfare and issues, and I know there was a lot of issues with I want to say Saybrook, the Saybrook colony.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a little while since my brain was in Connecticut colonial, pre-colonial stuff, but I
Yeah.
do know, and it's interesting that those were before the Salem witch trials.
Yeah. Well, I just found here this little factoid that in 1635, Plymouth colony made it a crime to, quote, form a solemn compact with the devil by way of witchcraft. So, okay.
The
You
crime.
know,
Ugh,
Well, one thing that strikes me about Rhode Island, which is really, I think, one of my favorite New England state, even though I've never lived there. But um, Connecticut was a lot like Massachusetts. It was Puritan. These were very small, tight-knit communities, whereas Rhode Island was not only more tolerant because of, Roger Williams and the history and everything, but it was a port city. It was a city where people from a lot of different places came.
it's still like
And
that.
yeah,
If you think about
I
Newport is very, very diverse. It's
yeah.
incredibly diverse.
And I think port cities in general are. Boston would have been the exception, but it was so Puritan, and the Puritans had so much control until they blew it with the Salem witch trials.
Right?
Big mistake, guys.
Yeah, no kidding. And I wonder, because I know a lot of people did leave Massachusetts because of. Now, I think actually
Yes.
going rewinding, it's my understanding that I'm just going to say they didn't. It wasn't just about fleeing religious persecution. Ironically, that they're fleeing the. I know there was some of that, but
Yeah.
a lot of the original I'm gonna say colonies, but it was what am I trying to say? There was a lot of merchant companies sending over groups to start towns to further their
Right.
business. It was a commercial venture is what I'm going for. Um,
Right.
there was a lot of commerce going on as far as like, I know, people would get I don't know if they were charters, but uh why is the word escaping me? They would get such and such merchant company in Europe would be like, all right, group,
Yeah.
here's your blah blah blah. Get over there and start a town for me or a settlement, whatever. And then
It was a charter.
is it called a charter for if it's not
Mm-hmm.
from the king, if you will?
Oh.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh.
I'm
But
probably using the wrong word, but
that's okay.
yeah. So my point
I
being that it was a lot. There was a lot of commerce going on as opposed to the or and my brain is just not working. Settlement.
Oh yeah, farming,
Yeah,
agriculture,
like getting
land grabbing.
exactly. I can't think of the word. My gosh, not a manifest destiny, but like a get over there and make footing for the company or the country. It was less about the religious aspects of things, which I think we often look at. However, the Puritans were puritanical in their approach with their religion.
They also wrote about everything.
Yeah,
And
they did.
history is written by the winners, and the
Mhm.
Puritans wrote down everything, including their prejudices against Anglicans, well, anybody who wasn't Puritan pretty much, although, they
Right.
tolerated some people more than others. But it's one of the things in that my husband and I, who do the New England Historical Society, something we've realized over the years is that there is a lot of French history. There's a lot of history that people don't know about because it was written through an English lens. And there's a lot of French history in New England. There's a lot of
Mm,
Italian history in New England. There's a lot of Irish. Well, we probably know about the Irish history, but maybe not as much as we think. There's
true.
more than the potato famine. But because the Puritans were they were all they were well educated and they wrote down everything, and their version of history is the one that got recorded, which is probably why you haven't heard about the Connecticut witchcraft trials, because they didn't want you to know about it, so they didn't write about it.
Well,
But
I don't think I'd want the future to know about those actions either.
no,
My
no,
God.
no, no,
And
and it really was such a stain on Massachusetts. It was not forgotten that
no,
they did this horrible thing.
it continues to this day. I mean, it's like you said, the top 10 books are
Yeah.
about the witch trials, and it's literally it's not stained, it's deeper. It's like, imprinted on our
Oh,
it,
our
it's
psyches.
yeah, yeah, I'm trying to find the right word, and it's funny because we lived in near Salem for a time when we were younger, and I've been going to Salem for most of my life. Like, it's just a thing, it was
Yeah.
kind of far as I got older. Like, Salem is a little bit far from where I grew up, but ultimately, but I mean, we would make semi-regular trips to Salem. It's so important, but also I wonder you see things today and I don't buy all of the I hate using the word conspiracy theories, but I don't know what other word to use. I don't buy a lot of that. However, I can be open-minded to things like creating hysteria over something to kind of
Distract from,
to
yeah,
distract, or yeah, to further a narrative, or things like that. And
yeah.
it's really interesting when you question today, like, is this legit, or is this, is this just here for to distract me, or some sort of hysterical thing that we're supposed to get hysterical about. But you look back and if there's, you've got this French and Indian War going on, and there's all this. I mean, it was warfare for, America and of course it wasn't America and Canada then, but um, there is warfare between the French and the English, and there. Oh, I mean, historically, going back to Europe, there has been, but um, it's just interesting that back then it seems that this hysteria was created against a certain narrative then. Like, oh, there's going to be this slave revolt, and then we've got this army in the swamp, and then there's the war on the frontier of Maine, and you know these guys are bad, all that whole thing. And
Yeah.
people really did die from it, and it's crazy. Like, we look back and it's crazy, like, oh my god, this happened. But we might not be hanging each other now, but I mean, it's still I think that what do you say, not the mindset, but the that part of human nature that does that is still happening on a
Oh,
lesser
yeah.
scale. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's
Oh,
still,
sure.
Humans are
gosh,
barbarians.
oh, they are.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, they are. I always say this, and this helped me when I realized this, that there are, and I'll probably say this every single episode because I feel like it just applies. Every time you walk into a situation, there's going to be like the moral people and the good people, and then the ones that aren't so much that. And it's not by your profession or your race or anything. It's just human nature that some people are good and some people are not. And this just spans history, and it's going to be into our future, so no matter where you are in time or place, or there's going to be, the people who are into the hysteria and the ones that are not. There's the ones
Oh, yeah.
perpetuating it, the ones trying to, hey, wait, maybe we shouldn't hang these people, like. And that's just kind of I don't want to say society in embryo, but something like that. So I feel like it's kind of the same thing that we see today, just on a very different scale. And it's
Oh,
very,
absolutely.
you know
Yeah,
what I mean?
absolutely. Well, I hear it when, people are called terrorists.
Mm,
One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, but oh,
right. Exactly.
terrorist, terrorist, The
Hmm.
and I think in Salem the there was really a very tangible fear because there were people, there were refugees, destitute refugees who
Right.
were, some people were mentally disturbed the by by seeing your entire family, wiped out in front of your eyes with people bearing hatchets and, your relatives' heads. And the stories were horrible about the torture. There
Right.
was one massacre where they died by being slow roasted over fires, and their their limbs were hacked off and eaten in front of them. And whether it's true or not, they were scary. And the world then, I mean, Salem was 1692, there was a lot of wilderness out there.
Mm,
There were storms that were, God was mad at you if there was an earthquake or a terrifying hurricane. There were sea serpents and monsters, and I think part of it was just a lack of scientific knowledge, but another big part of it was human nature, just being susceptible to that kind of thing. And there's a saying that I've heard recently, and it goes, environment trumps intention, which means you may want to do something, but your environment is going to, it's the things you see around you on a conscious and more important, probably a subconscious level, really influence you. So I think there was a lot of subconscious stuff going on in Salem with, this sense of fear.
Right. And that's very true. You do hear a lot of stories about the torture aspect, and that goes. I've researched a lot of Native American history, and I was very interested in it when I was young, and so I started young. And I remember you hear the famous thing about Tecumseh talks about no more torture, and this is in the mid 1700s, I think, early to mid 1700s. So I mean, this was a thing,
Oh
um,
yeah.
and and then scalping and selling, bounties for scalps, and so like that's extremely terrifying. And I
Oh
know,
yeah.
the story of Mary Ingalls in West Virginia, Blue Ridge. I think she was West Virginia, and this was much later too, late mid to late 1700s, I believe. And her family was massacred, and she was taken off, and she watched babies get killed in front of her. So like that's crazy. Like that is terrifying, and like it even embellished. Well, even not embellished, it's terrifying. But if there was
Yeah.
any embellishment, or you add on to all these other and that is terrifying. And it's true what you say about environment changes or Trump's intention. Like I've had things where I'm like, I don't really like that song, and someone will be like, I love this song, and I'm like, so if you love it, why don't I love it?
And then
That's
you
all.
keep hearing it,
Right.
and you start to like it.
Yeah, and then you're like, oh well, it's not so bad. And I see this with my kids all the time. I'll be like, okay, when so and so says such and such to you, you're gonna do blah 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 because whatever it is at school, let's say. And they come home and tell me the exact opposite, because in the environment they're doing something
Yeah.
completely different. So it's very true. And when you get groups of people together, I think that kind of um
Yep.
snowballs. It kind of just gets
Yeah.
it amplifies. Human nature is so interesting. Oh my gosh, I find it fascinating, and how it applies to history.
Terrifying and fascinating. I can only imagine.
Yeah.
I can only imagine getting caught up in that hysteria. Like, because what do you say? You're like, oh, maybe we shouldn't hang these people. Maybe maybe they're not a witch, and then it's just like, oh, you're a witch too. Like you just get caught. Like
Oh yeah. That
going,
happened.
you know.
Right.
And I mean, I'm coming from somebody who's like, I don't. I have this like part of me that's just like justice like needs to be served. Like I'm very, you know what I mean? Like I don't. I will stand up against things. I will say things that other people won't. I'm that
Mm.
type of person. So
That
it's
you
just
are.
yeah, exactly. You can co-sign it. You know me enough. And even at that, it's like that standing up in that sort of situation, just not going along with that would be incredibly difficult. Like, what do you do? It's just so crazy.
Yes.
I wonder what the landscape looked like after that. Like, what did the town look like? I imagine a lot of people left, directly following this. I'd imagine people branched off, and I don't even know. I don't even know how it affected law following that. A note on law.
Yes.
You said, if we were to go back, and you said you don't want to sound like a conspiracy or anything, but it's just like conspiracy is a very valid legal term. It's a very valid legal charge, like conspiracy to violate rights, conspiracy to defraud, conspiracy to commit murder. Like these are valid things. Like people clearly collude to do evil things. I
That
just
is
if there's evidence there, I don't want to be like, oh, it sounds like a conspiracy theory. I'd rather just call it out, like let's call it out. Like they did this.
mm, very,
you know?
very true. That's
So
true.
just a note.
Well,
Just a,
it's
There's kind of
go ahead.
I was just going to say there's kind of an interesting footnote to the French and Indian War, which is that Saint Castin, the baron who cleared Maine of the English settlements, he had a number of descendants. I think he had, well, whatever, he had a number of descendants, and one was a Penobscot Indian named Charles Shea, who was born in Connecticut, but he grew up on Indian Island, which is the Penobscot Reservation in Maine. And when he was 18 or 19, he became a medic. I can't remember if he was drafted or not, but Charles Shea became a medic in World War II, and he was there on D-Day and pulled a number of people, a number of soldiers who were wounded out of the sea, and saved a number of lives. And then ended up staying in Europe because he couldn't get a job in the United States. And he married a German woman, and he came back in the summer to the reservation, and he would speak German with University of Maine students. So he maintained his relationships in the United States and with his people, even though he lived in Europe. So today, he became the Penobscot Nation's ambassador to France. And he's gotten, I keep checking, he's over 100 years old, and he lives in France now. There is a park above Omaha Beach called, okay, I can't remember what the park is named, but there's a park above Omaha Beach with a turtle, a sculpture of a turtle, which is the Penobscot symbol. And Shea has maintained, and he's treated like royalty in France. So yeah, I'd stay there too. But he views the park is dedicated to 100 Native Americans who fought with the Allied forces on D-Day. And he calls it a continuation of the Native alliance with the French, which goes back to 400 years. And I thought that was really kind of cool.
That is kind of cool. That's fascinating. He's
No,
over 100.
yeah, no,
That's
no,
fascinating.
no witch link there, but
Yeah. Yeah, but it's still it's really interesting to know. Like, I've done a little bit of following of where I sound hokey, where the Penobscot are now.
oh yeah,
After all of that.
yeah,
And where I am in Vermont, I know a good amount of people who, because a lot of the people from down in Mass went up north during that. So it's very interesting to see how it, I hate to say these words so simply, but how where they are now, and that
yeah.
they are still here, very much so. But that story is very fascinating. That's very cool.
I think in Maine, the Penobscot, they had a delegate. You know how American Samoa has a delegate to Congress? I think the Penobscot, they did have a delegate to the Maine legislature, but I think they quit when Paul LePage was governor. He offended them to such an extent they may be back. I don't know.
Yeah,
They were,
interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean we're digressing a little bit, but they were granted. They went to when the Continental Congress was meeting in Watertown. They went to Watertown and said, "Hey, we'll fight with you guys if you give us the land along the Penobscot River." And they did. I think 4 miles on either side. And guess what happened? You know what happened. They didn't
Yeah, I'm
get
like, I can only guess.
Yeah, yeah,
Surprise, surprise. Yeah,
yeah.
that's a whole other discussion there. Leslie, I just want to say, like, thank you for coming on the show, because I love talking with you. Because like I've said before, like, I'm such a New England history person, and when I found your website, it was like a gold mine to me, because it's just this informative blog after blog after blog of just like this informative New England history, and I just love it, and I'm so glad we could have this conversation. And really, when we broached the topic of talking about the French and Indian War influence on the Salem witch trials, I was like, yes, let's do it. I think we're all really, yeah, I think we're all like really excited about that. That being said, if people are more interested in the work that you do, because you do a lot of research and a lot of writing, where can people find you? Where's the best way to find your work? Is there any work, but I know you have a few books. Um, where can people find you and your work?
Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you, John.
Oh, thank you.
Um, www.newenglandhistoricalsociety.com will get you to our website. And on our website, we probably are flogging a couple of our books, but you can also look up my author page on Amazon, or my husband's author page, Dan Landergan or Leslie Landergan on Amazon. And they do a great job actually of promoting books. So the next one that's coming out, we've got the cover, got the manuscript, still need to proofread it, is called How the French Came to New England. And it has a lot about the French and Indian Wars and the impact they had on American history. Part of it was, the French kind of lost and they came back to seek revenge during the American Revolution.
Yes, that they did.
In a big way.
Oh yeah. So yeah, we'll also link all that stuff in the description. But Leslie, yeah, thank you. This has been great. I really appreciate
you, John.
Thank
you, John. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mary. It's been really fun.
Yeah, I'm glad you had a good time. Maybe we could have you on again. It was like a little mini history lesson. So if you guys want to hear it, you want to check out more, we'll have Leslie's info below. And have a great evening, everybody. Goodbye. Till next time.